You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, a short bonus episode to remind you about important anniversaries from the Revolutionary War. This week, we remember George Washington's proposal to invade Boston, which he made on February 16th, 1776. By the end of February 1776, the siege of Boston had been underway for 10 months. Congress had sent General Washington to take command of the new army back in the summer. Washington had almost no combat experience and had never led more than a regiment before this. He had told Congress that he did not feel qualified for the role when he accepted it. He very much wanted to prove himself by having some sort of great victory at Boston. Since he had arrived in July of 1775, there had been very little combat. Part of this was the fact that the Continentals had almost no gunpowder. Another part was the difficulty in maintaining his army over the winter when so many men wanted to go home. A big part of it was the fact that the British were pretty well defended. Boston at the time was almost an island. Only a narrow strip of land called Boston Neck connected the town to the mainland. The British had built entrenchments backed by artillery to prevent any assault across that strip of land. Although the Americans had at least 3 times the number of soldiers, the idea of a water crossing past the British Navy and a contested water landing in Boston against British regulars was thought to be suicide. The result was that the Continentals sat on the mainland only watching the enemy for months and months and months. The British had already received orders from London to abandon Boston. The commanding general, William Howe, was simply waiting for an opportunity to shift his focus to New York City. Washington had received word about such plans, but wasn't sure whether it was really true. The Americans knew that the British were putting together a larger army and fleet which would arrive in America in the spring. Washington hoped that he could force the British to evacuate Boston before then. As both armies struggled to stay warm during the brutally cold winter around Boston, Washington had an idea. If Boston Harbor froze over, the Continentals could simply march across the ice and assault Boston directly. The British Navy would be unable to adjust its ships if they were stuck in the ice. The assault could proceed without the Continentals needing to have their own boats or worry about a water landing on the edge of Boston. Connecticut and New Hampshire had sent more than 7,000 reinforcements in January, nearly doubling the Army's numbers. It was about 3 times the size of the British in Boston. Calling out the militia might even double the large force again from what they already had on hand. Colonel Henry Knox had recently arrived with a line of artillery to support the army. Everything seemed to be coming together. Washington called a council of war on February 16th. By this time, General Charles Lee had already left for New York, but Major Generals Artemus Ward and Israel Putnam attended, as did Brigadier Generals Horatio Gates, John Thomas, William Heath, Joseph Spencer, and John Sullivan. Washington discussed his idea of an invasion across the ice into Boston. The other generals at the meeting were, shall we say, less than enthusiastic. While the Americans had more numbers, the soldiers were untried in an offensive action. They would have no defenses while crossing the ice and could be mowed down by British artillery and small arms. While the Continentals did have more cannons now, they still did not have enough gunpowder for a sustained artillery battle. In short, such an attack could result in a disaster. The generals agreed not to proceed. Instead, they considered another plan. As they attempted to collect more powder, they would plan to occupy nearby Dorchester Heights. The new artillery could be used to fire on both Boston and the ships in the harbor. The British would either have to evacuate or they would have to attack Continental defenses around Dorchester. Forcing the British to attack Continental defenses seemed much preferred to having the Continentals attack British defenses. Following this meeting, Washington gave up on his idea of a direct assault on Boston and focused on the plan to occupy Dorchester Heights. I hope you've enjoyed this Revolution 250 moment. For more context on the events discussed today, check out episode 85 of the American Revolution podcast, which you can access at blog.amrevpodcast.com. You can also subscribe for free to this podcast on any podcast platform you like. Thanks again for listening to this Revolution 250 moment on the American Revolution podcast.